After the stormy night at the guest house, I went back to the city believing I had left everything unusual behind, with the sound of the crashing waves and the rain beating against the old wooden roof. My life slipped back into its familiar rhythm. I answered emails, met impossible deadlines, grabbed coffee from the same corner cafe every morning, and convinced myself that the quiet conversations I had shared with Noah Bennett, the owner's son, were nothing more than an unexpected memory from a weekend that would soon fade away. Then, less than a week later, my phone buzzed nonstop before I had even finished breakfast. At first I ignored it, assuming another group chat had exploded over something trivial. But when I finally looked down, dozens of notifications filled the screen. Friends were tagging me. Old classmates were sending laughing emojis. Even coworkers I barely spoke to suddenly wanted to know if I had been hiding a relationship from everyone. One message simply read, "So, when were you planning to tell us?" Another said, "Honestly, you two look perfect together." I stared at the words, confused, until someone forwarded a local community page from the coastal town where the guest house stood. There, buried between restaurant reviews and weather updates, was a post claiming that the guest house owner's son had finally found his boyfriend after years of staying single. The boyfriend, according to hundreds of strangers in the comments, was me. My heart skipped. I clicked the photos. One showed Noah and me carrying grocery bags after the storm knocked out power across the neighborhood. Another captured us laughing outside the bakery while waiting for fresh bread. A third caught him handing me an umbrella as we crossed the street together. Harmless moments. Ordinary moments. Somehow, stitched together, they looked like the beginning of a romance neither of us had ever announced. The comments multiplied by the minute. Some insisted they had seen us walking along the shoreline. Others confidently claimed we had been sharing breakfast every morning. A few even declared that everyone in town already knew we were a couple long before the pictures appeared online. None of it was true. We had never confirmed anything because there had never been anything to confirm. Yet the certainty in those comments was unsettling. People weren't asking if the rumor was true. They were arguing over how long we had supposedly been together. My closest friend called before I could process any of it. "Seriously, Ethan," she laughed. "How could you keep something this big from us?" I tried explaining there was no relationship, but even my denial sounded weak against the mountain of photographs circulating online. By lunchtime, my older sister texted a smiling face followed by, "Mom wants to know when she's meeting him." Across the state, Noah wasn't escaping the chaos either. I found that out when another mutual acquaintance sent me a screenshot from the guest house's social media page. Regular customers had begun teasing him in the comments, asking if special couple discounts would be available during the holidays. Someone joked that the storm had brought more than heavy rain. Someone else replied that real love always arrived unexpectedly. I should have laughed. Instead, an uncomfortable knot settled in my chest. It wasn't just that strangers believed a story that never happened. It was how naturally everyone accepted it, as though they had witnessed chapters of our lives that neither of us remembered living. I looked at the last photograph one more time. Noah was smiling at me from beneath the umbrella, and I was smiling back without realizing the camera had been there. It was an innocent moment, frozen forever. Yet somehow that single glance had become evidence. That ordinary weekend had become a love story, and before either of us had spoken a single word about it, the entire town had already decided how our story began. The only question left was whether the rumor would disappear as quickly as it arrived, or whether it had already changed both of our lives before either of us understood why. The rumor refused to fade. Every morning it found a new way to follow me, appearing in another comment, another message, another awkward conversation that always began with a smile and ended with someone insisting I did not have to keep pretending. Even my coworkers had stopped asking whether it was true. Instead, they asked how Noah was doing, as though they had known him for years. One afternoon, my manager casually suggested that I should invite him to the company picnic because, in his words, everyone deserved a +1. I forced a laugh and changed the subject, but the strange part was no longer the questions. The strange part was how naturally Noah's name fit into the empty spaces of my daily life. I had only spent a few days at the guest house, yet I kept remembering details that should have disappeared by now. I remembered the way he always checked the weather before opening the front porch each morning. I remembered how he quietly repaired a broken chair before any guest noticed it. I remembered how he listened more than he spoke, making every conversation feel surprisingly easy. Those memories returned without permission, usually when I least expected them. While waiting for coffee, while sitting in traffic, while staring out my apartment window long after sunset. One evening, I finally opened the guest house website again, telling myself I only wanted to see whether the rumors had forced them to disable the comments. Instead, I found new photographs from recent guests. Noah was standing on the front porch, smiling politely beside a family checking out after the weekend. He looked exactly the same, except now I noticed something I had overlooked before. His smile never quite reached his eyes. It was warm enough for everyone else, but somehow it carried a quiet loneliness I had missed while we were together. I closed the page almost immediately, annoyed at myself for looking so closely. My phone buzzed before I could put it down. It was a message from an old college friend who had somehow discovered the story. "You know," he wrote, "if people are making up a romance, at least they picked someone who seems decent." I almost ignored it, but my fingers hesitated above the keyboard. Decent. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. Because he was decent. He had never encouraged the rumors. He had never tried to benefit from them. As far as I knew, he was probably dealing with the same uncomfortable questions every single day. Suddenly, the whole situation felt unfair. Not because strangers believed something that was false, but because neither of us had chosen to become characters in someone else's story. I wondered if I should call him, apologize for everything neither of us had done, or simply pretend none of it existed until people found another distraction. Every option felt strangely difficult. That night, sleep refused to come. Rain tapped softly against my apartment window, sounding almost identical to the storm that had trapped us inside the guest house. I lay awake replaying every conversation we had shared, searching for some hidden moment that could explain why complete strangers had looked at us and seen something I had completely missed. Then a thought slipped quietly into my mind, so simple that it almost frightened me. What if everyone had only misunderstood the timing? They believed we were already in love. They were wrong. But what if the only thing they had gotten wrong was that it had not happened yet? I sat up in bed, staring into the darkness as my own heartbeat answered the question before my mind could argue with it. If everyone already believed we were in love, then perhaps the only thing that was not true was that I had never been brave enough to admit how much I wanted to see him again. 2 days later, I packed a small overnight bag, requested a day off from work, and pointed my car back toward the coast. The drive felt completely different from the first time. When I had traveled there before, I had been escaping deadlines and searching for a quiet weekend. Now I was carrying questions I could no longer ignore. The highway stretched for miles beneath a clear blue sky, but my thoughts stayed tangled somewhere between the city and the little guest house overlooking the ocean. I rehearsed dozens of conversations during the 3-hour drive. In some of them I apologized for the rumors. In others I laughed them off with Noah, promising that the whole town would eventually find another story to chase. None of those conversations felt honest. The truth was much simpler and somehow much harder to say. By the time I reached the familiar streets, the town looked exactly as I remembered. The bakery still displayed fresh pies in the front window. The bookstore still had its handwritten recommendations standing on the sidewalk. The salty breeze carried the same comforting scent from the harbor. It was strange how a place could remain unchanged while the person returning to it had become someone entirely different. When I parked outside the guest house, my hand stayed on the steering wheel for several long seconds. I could see Noah through the office window, organizing reservation cards behind the front desk. He looked up as the sound of my car door echoed across the quiet parking lot. Surprise crossed his face first, then uncertainty, then the same calm smile I had remembered ever since leaving. He stepped outside before I even reached the front porch. "Ethan," he said gently, "I was not expecting to see you again so soon." I smiled. Although my heart was beating so loudly I wondered if he could hear it. Neither was I admitted. For a moment, we simply stood there while the wind moved through the trees surrounding the property. Neither of us mentioned the rumors. Neither of us mentioned the photographs. Somehow those things already felt smaller than the silence between us. Noah finally laughed softly. "I should probably apologize. My regular guests have been asking about you every single day. One couple even wanted to know whether we were planning to decorate the dining room for a wedding." I laughed with him, relieved that the tension had cracked just enough for us to breathe again. "My family has not been much better," I confessed. "My mother already thinks she knows everything about you." He shook his head with an embarrassed smile. People really do enjoy writing stories. Yes, I answered quietly. They do. We walked toward the shoreline without deciding to. The afternoon sun painted long reflections across the water while seabirds drifted above the waves. We talked about ordinary things first. Business at the guest house. My latest projects in the city. The storm damage that had finally been repaired. Every sentence made it easier to remember why speaking with him had always felt so effortless. Eventually, we reached the same overlook where we had stood during the storm only weeks before. Noah rested his hands against the wooden railing and looked toward the horizon. I kept thinking you might come back, he admitted without looking at me. Not because of the rumors. I just hoped you enjoyed being here. I took a slow breath. That was the moment every excuse disappeared. I had not driven all this way to explain gossip started by strangers. I had come because pretending no longer felt possible. I turned toward him and met his eyes. Maybe they were wrong about when it started, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. But they are not wrong about how I feel now. The breeze seemed to fall quiet around us. Noah looked at me in complete silence, and for the first time since that unforgettable storm, neither of us needed anyone else to tell our story. Noah did not answer right away. He simply looked at me with an expression that seemed caught somewhere between surprise and relief, as though he had imagined this conversation 100 different ways but never believed it would actually happen. The breeze carried the sound of distant waves against the rocks below, filling the silence that neither of us seemed eager to interrupt. Finally, he smiled, not the careful smile he offered guests checking into the guest house, but one that reached his eyes for the first time since I had known him. I was beginning to think I had imagined that connection too, he admitted quietly. After you left, I kept telling myself it was only because we were trapped here by the storm. I thought that once you went back to the city, everything would return to normal. I laughed softly and looked out across the water. It did return to normal. That was the problem. He nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. We stayed by the overlook until the afternoon light slowly turned golden. The conversation became easier after that. We spoke honestly instead of carefully. Noah admitted he had almost called me several times after I returned home, but convinced himself that it would only make the rumors worse. I admitted I had opened the guest house website more times than I wanted to confess. Instead of making the situation awkward, those small confessions dissolved whatever uncertainty remained between us. We eventually walked back toward the guest house together. A few familiar guests sitting on the front porch noticed us approaching side by side. An older woman looked up from her book, smiled knowingly, and whispered something to her husband that made them both grin. Noah sighed with playful embarrassment. See what I have been dealing with. I could not help smiling. I think I finally understand. As we stepped inside, the lobby felt warm and welcoming, filled with the comforting scent of fresh coffee and homemade cookies cooling on the counter. Noah offered to make dinner before the evening guests arrived, insisting that I was still technically a visitor even if I had returned much sooner than expected. I followed him into the kitchen, where preparing a simple meal somehow became more enjoyable than any expensive restaurant I had visited back in the city. We chopped vegetables together, laughed when I reached for the wrong seasoning twice, and discovered that ordinary moments could become memorable simply because of who shared them with you. Later that evening, we carried 2 mugs of hot tea onto the back porch. The sky above the ocean slowly filled with stars while the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. It felt strangely familiar, almost as if the storm that had first brought us together had quietly left behind something neither of us recognized until now. My phone vibrated on the small wooden table. Another message had arrived from one of my friends asking whether the rumors were finally true. I looked at the screen for a second before locking it without replying. Noah noticed the gesture and raised an eyebrow. You are not going to answer? He asked. I smiled and slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. Not tonight. Why not? He asked with quiet curiosity. I looked toward the endless line where the ocean met the darkening sky. Because for the first time, I do not feel like explaining anything. Noah leaned back in his chair, watching me with that calm expression I had come to recognize so well. After a moment, he quietly reached across the small table and rested his hand beside mine without rushing. Without pressure, simply leaving me the choice to close the distance if I wanted to. I looked down at the few inches separating our hands and realized that every mile I had driven back to this town had been leading to this simple moment. I smiled, gently placed my hand beside his, and neither of us said another word because the silence between us finally felt complete instead of uncertain. I stayed at the guest house through the weekend, telling myself I would head back to the city on Monday morning. But those 2 days quietly changed the rhythm of everything. There was no dramatic announcement, no official conversation about what we were supposed to call whatever had begun between us. Instead, we simply spent time together. I helped Noah prepare breakfast before the guests came downstairs, learning which coffee blend the regular visitors preferred and which homemade muffins disappeared first every Saturday morning. He laughed when I accidentally placed blueberry muffins on the wrong serving tray, then patiently showed me the simple system he had followed for years. Somewhere between folding fresh towels, watering flowers on the front porch, and greeting travelers checking in for the weekend, the awkwardness that had once surrounded us disappeared completely. It felt less like visiting and more like returning somewhere I had never realized I missed. The rumors, surprisingly, never stopped. If anything, seeing us together only convinced everyone that the story they had invented had been true from the beginning. An elderly couple who had stayed at the guest house every summer for nearly a decade smiled as we carried luggage into the lobby together. The husband quietly leaned toward me and whispered, "We knew the two of you would figure it out eventually." Noah overheard him and rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed smile. I expected him to deny it the way we both had during those first confusing days, but he only thanked the couple for visiting again and continued carrying their bags inside. Once we were alone, I looked at him with a curious smile. "You did not correct them?" He shrugged as though the answer were obvious. Would they have believed me? I considered that for a moment before laughing. Probably not. He laughed too, and somehow the rumors no longer felt like an invisible enemy following us everywhere. They had become background noise, fading further away each time we chose honesty with each other instead of worrying about strangers. That afternoon, we closed the front desk early after every guest had settled in. Noah suggested we walk down to the beach before sunset, saying it had become his favorite way to end a busy day. The tide was low, leaving a wide stretch of smooth sand along the shoreline. We walked without rushing, occasionally stopping to collect unusual shells or watch children building sandcastles near the water. It was ordinary in every possible way, and perhaps that was exactly what made it unforgettable. There was no pressure to impress each other, no expectation that every moment had to feel extraordinary. We simply enjoyed the comfort of being side by side. As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, Noah finally broke the quiet. "Do you know what has surprised me the most?" he asked. I shook my head. "I spent weeks worrying about what everyone else believed," he said. "Then you came back, and I realized the only opinion I was waiting for was yours." I looked at the waves rolling gently onto the shore before answering. I think I spent just as much time trying to prove strangers wrong that I forgot to ask myself what I actually wanted. Noah smiled at that, and we continued walking until the first stars appeared overhead. When we eventually turned back toward the guest house, I noticed a teenager standing near the boardwalk, holding up a phone. He smiled politely and asked if we would mind taking a picture with him because he thought we looked happy together. Noah glanced at me, silently leaving the decision to me. A few weeks earlier, I would have refused without hesitation. Instead, I smiled, stepped beside him, and agreed. As the camera clicked, I realized something unexpected. The photograph was no longer capturing a rumor created by strangers. For the first time, it was preserving a memory that truly belonged to us. Monday morning arrived much faster than either of us wanted. The guest house slowly came alive with the familiar sounds of luggage rolling across the wooden floor, coffee brewing in the kitchen, and early travelers checking out before beginning the long drive home. I stood on the front porch holding my overnight bag, knowing I had responsibilities waiting for me in the city, but feeling strangely reluctant to leave. Noah walked me to my car without saying much at first. The comfortable silence between us had become something we no longer felt the need to fill. Before I opened the driver's door, he handed me a small paper bag. "Lunch," he said with a quiet smile. "You always forget to eat when you drive." I laughed in surprise. "How do you know that?" He folded his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "Because you did exactly that the first time you came here. You arrived hungry and pretended it was not a big deal." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. I had not even realized he remembered something so small. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "For everything." He looked at me for a moment before answering. Come back when you can. Not because of the guest house. His smile grew warmer. Because I would like to see you again. The drive back to the city felt shorter than ever before. Every mile seemed to carry a new certainty instead of the confusion that had filled my previous trip. By the time I reached my apartment, the paper bag Noah had packed was still sitting untouched on the passenger seat. Inside was a neatly wrapped turkey sandwich, a bottle of iced tea, and a handwritten note folded into a square no bigger than a business card. The message contained only one sentence. Do not wait for another storm before coming back. I read those words 3 times before carefully placing the note inside my wallet. The following week settled into a new routine that neither of us planned, but both of us quietly protected. We spoke every evening after work, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for more than an hour. We talked about ordinary things that would have sounded completely unimportant to anyone else. Noah told me about guests who accidentally booked the wrong weekends every summer. I told him about impossible clients who could never decide which color looked better in a design. Some nights we barely said anything meaningful at all, yet hanging up always felt more difficult than making the call. We also began visiting each other whenever our schedules allowed. If I had a free weekend, I drove to the coast. If Noah could leave the guest house for a day, he explored the city with me, fascinated by bookstores, museums, and quiet coffee shops hidden between busy streets. Friends on both sides quickly noticed the change. Mine stopped asking whether the rumors were true because they could see the answer every time Noah's name appeared on my phone, and I smiled before reading the message. His regular guests welcomed me back as though I had always belonged there, often greeting me before they greeted him. One Saturday afternoon, while helping Noah repaint a weathered fence beside the garden, I noticed a familiar woman from the bakery walking past the property. She waved enthusiastically and called out. I told everyone those rumors would have a happy ending. Noah and I looked at each other before laughing at exactly the same moment. We no longer felt embarrassed. We no longer felt the need to explain that strangers had accidentally written the first chapter of our story before either of us understood what it meant. The beginning had never belonged to us, but everything that came afterward did, built one honest conversation, one long drive, one shared meal, and one quiet promise at a time. Autumn arrived almost without warning, painting the trees along the coastal highway in shades of gold and deep orange. By then, the 3-hour drive between the city and the guest house had become so familiar that I could almost measure time by the landmarks along the route instead of the miles on the road. Friday evenings belonged to the drive toward the ocean. Sunday nights belonged to the drive home. Somewhere between those two destinations, Noah and I had quietly built a life that neither of us had expected to find. Nothing about it felt rushed. We never made grand promises or dramatic declarations. Instead, we learned each other's habits one ordinary day at a time. He knew I always reached for coffee before I was fully awake. I knew he could never walk past a struggling plant without stopping to water it. He remembered every guest's favorite breakfast. I remembered every story he had told me about growing up in the guest house that had been in his family for generations. The smallest details somehow became the strongest foundation we had ever known. One Saturday afternoon, heavy clouds gathered over the shoreline again, reminding both of us of the storm that had first crossed our paths. The rain arrived gently this time, tapping against the wide front windows while guests settled into the lounge with books and warm drinks. Noah and I remained on the covered porch, watching the rain drift across the empty beach. Do you ever think about that first weekend? I asked quietly. He smiled without taking his eyes off the ocean. Almost every day. I laughed softly. Me too. He looked at me then, his expression thoughtful. You know what I realized recently? I shook my head. If that storm had never happened, you probably would have stayed somewhere else. I nodded. And if someone had never taken those pictures, I might have convinced myself that what I felt was only temporary. We stood in comfortable silence until Noah quietly added, Funny how life can begin with something completely unplanned. Before I could answer, the front door opened behind us. The elderly couple who returned every summer stepped outside, carrying 2 umbrellas. The woman smiled warmly when she saw us together. There you are, she said. We have been looking everywhere for our favorite couple. Noah glanced toward me with the familiar amused expression that had replaced his old embarrassment months ago. I smiled back before answering the couple myself. You found us. The words slipped out naturally, without hesitation, and only after I heard them did I realize how much had changed. I was no longer afraid of what people believed because the truth had finally become simple. Later that evening, after the rain had stopped, Noah and I walked to the overlook where everything had shifted between us. The clouds slowly parted, revealing a sky filled with brilliant stars reflected across the calm ocean below. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the same handwritten note he had once left inside my lunch bag. It had become worn around the edges from being carried so often. I almost threw this away after writing it, he admitted with a quiet laugh. I thought maybe it sounded foolish. I gently took the folded paper from his hand before slipping it back into his pocket. I am glad you did not. He looked at me with the same calm warmth that had first made the noisy world around us disappear. So am I. Standing there beneath the clear night sky, I finally understood that the rumors had never been the reason we found each other. They had only pointed us toward a truth we both needed the courage to discover on our own. And every ordinary day since then had quietly proven that the happiest stories are not the ones strangers choose to tell about us, but the ones we patiently create together. By early winter, the story that had once belonged to whispers and curious glances had become something much quieter. People in town no longer stopped us with surprised smiles because seeing us together had simply become part of everyday life. The excitement surrounding the old rumor gradually disappeared, replaced by something far more ordinary. We were no longer the unexpected story everyone wanted to discuss. We were simply Ethan and Noah. One crisp Saturday morning, while helping Noah organize storage boxes in the guest house office, I came across a small envelope tucked beneath an old guest registry. Inside were several printed photographs from the weekend of the storm. I immediately recognized them. They were the same pictures that had spread across local social media months earlier. There we were carrying groceries together, laughing outside the bakery, and walking beneath the umbrella that afternoon. Before I could ask anything, Noah looked over my shoulder and smiled with quiet recognition. I wondered when those would turn up, he said. Where did they come from? I asked. He picked up one of the photographs and turned it over. On the back was a handwritten note with the name of a local photography club. Noah explained that a retired schoolteacher in town had been documenting everyday life around the harbor for a community exhibition. During the storm, she happened to capture dozens of ordinary moments throughout the neighborhood. Someone had posted only a handful of those pictures online without any explanation, and everyone else had built the rest of the story on assumptions. A week later, when the photographer realized what had happened, she publicly explained that the photographs had never been intended to suggest a romantic relationship. They were simply candid moments showing neighbors helping one another after the storm. The correction had been shared online, but by then almost nobody paid attention anymore because the excitement had already faded. I stared at the photographs for a long moment before quietly laughing. So the mystery was never really a mystery. Noah smiled. No, it was just a collection of ordinary moments. We carried the envelope onto the front porch, where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the empty parking area. Looking through the complete collection changed everything. There were pictures of children stacking sandbags before the rain arrived, volunteers carrying supplies into nearby businesses, families sharing umbrellas, and strangers helping one another across flooded sidewalks. Our photographs had never been special because they proved a rumor. They were special because they captured kindness during an unexpected storm. I looked at Noah and shook my head with a smile. All this time, I thought those pictures changed my life. He gently took one photograph from the stack and held it beside the others. Maybe they did, he answered. Just not for the reason everyone believed. His words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. The rumor had disappeared almost as quietly as it had begun. The photographer had clarified the truth. The town had moved on to new conversations. No one talked about secret romances anymore because there was nothing left to speculate about. We no longer needed strangers to guess what existed between us. The assumptions had ended, but our story had not. As the sun began to set beyond the ocean, I slipped one of the photographs into my wallet beside the handwritten note Noah had once given me. One picture had accidentally introduced us to the world. The other reminded me to keep coming back. Together, they no longer represented a misunderstanding. They had become simple reminders that sometimes the truth arrives long after the rumors disappear, and when it finally does, it is often quieter, steadier, and far more beautiful than anything people imagined in the beginning. Spring arrived before either of us realized another season had passed. The guest house garden was filled with fresh flowers, the front porch had been painted again, and the familiar drive between the city and the coast no longer felt like a trip between two different lives. It simply felt like going home. Noah and I had reached a place where nothing needed to be rushed because everything important had already been proven through ordinary days shared together. We had learned that love was rarely built through dramatic moments alone. It grew through early morning coffee, quiet evening walks, handwritten notes tucked into lunch bags, and long conversations that made 3 hours on the highway feel surprisingly short. One Saturday, my family finally visited the guest house after months of hearing stories about the place and the man behind them. Noah greeted everyone with the same calm kindness that had first drawn me toward him, and within minutes my mother was laughing with him in the kitchen while my sister insisted on taking photographs of the ocean view. Watching them together, I realized there was no longer a line separating my life in the city from the one I had found on the coast. Somehow those two worlds had blended into one without either of us forcing it to happen. Later that afternoon, Noah and I slipped away to the overlook where I had first admitted my feelings. The railing had been repainted. The wind carried the scent of blooming flowers instead of approaching rain, and the waves below rolled gently toward the shore. Noah reached into his pocket and unfolded the faded note that had traveled with him for months before smiling and placing it into my hand. "I think you should keep this now," he said. I carefully folded it again before sliding it beside the photograph that had remained in my wallet ever since we discovered its true story. The two pieces of paper represented opposite beginnings. One had started with misunderstanding. The other had begun with honesty. Together they reminded me that every step, even the confusing ones, had quietly led us here. I looked at Noah and smiled. We never actually answered the question everyone kept asking. He tilted his head with quiet curiosity. Which question? Whether we were together. He laughed softly. That is true. I reached for his hand, and this time there was no hesitation from either of us. Then let us answer it now. His smile grew brighter than I had ever seen before. I would like that. We stood there looking out over the ocean that had unknowingly changed both of our lives months earlier. There was no audience waiting for an explanation, no rumors left to correct, and no expectations except the ones we chose for ourselves. We decided, together and without uncertainty, that this was the beginning of our real relationship. Not because strangers had imagined it. Not because photographs had suggested it. Simply because it was what both of us wanted. A few weeks later, several friends gathered at the guest house for a weekend barbecue. The afternoon was filled with laughter, music, and familiar faces enjoying the warm weather. At one point, one of my coworkers raised a glass with a teasing grin and called across the yard, "So, the rumors were true?" Noah looked at me before letting out a quiet laugh that immediately made everyone curious. Then he answered with the same calm confidence that had always made me trust him. Not back then. They just happened to predict the future. The entire group burst into laughter, and I could not help laughing with them because it was the simplest and most honest ending our story could have ever asked for. Sometimes life begins with a misunderstanding, sometimes with perfect timing, and sometimes with a rumor that accidentally points too ordinary people toward the place where they were always meant to find each other.